Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the third session of the Financing Low-Income Countries Toward a Realistic Aspirations and Concrete Actions in a Post-COVID World. I welcome you on behalf of the Center for Global Development that's sponsoring this conference. My name is Mark Plant. I'm a senior fellow at CGD. The first two sessions of our conference covered debt and private sector financing. And today we'll focus on domestic revenue mobilization, or DRM. It's a topic that everyone agrees is critical for advancing the recovery from the COVID crisis. External resources like debt or private financing, whether they are loans or grants from the private sector or public sector, are volatile and unreliable. Domestic resource mobilization is the only way for a country to assure that it will have the development financing it needs. Yet, I found that the subject seems to get short shrift in many of the policy discussions at the international level, with debt and private financing being sexier topics. Why is that? Basically because DRM is hard, and it doesn't lend itself easily to international policy actions. The history before COVID has shown that despite concerted efforts by low-income countries and donors, domestic resource mobilization as a percent of GDP has hardly budged in low-income countries. With few exceptions, the best predictor of a country's tax to GDP ratio today is a country's tax to GDP ratio 5 years or 10 years or 15 years ago. It's tough to make changes in DRM at both a technical level and a political level. No one likes to pay more taxes. So countries have to advance both agendas together and over a long period of time if they're going to get the resources they need to restore, recover, and reset their path to the SDGs. It takes a rare combination of technical know-how and political savvy to move DRM forward. Today, we have a panel of speakers and participants who have that combination of technical and political skills. They all have toiled in this area for years as policymakers, analysts, and advisors. And the basic question I'd pose to them today is, what challenges and opportunities does COVID-19 present for the DRM agenda? Is it just an extra burden, or does it present some game-changing opportunities that will let politics and technique work together to provide countries the reliable sources of financing they'll need? Before we start our discussions, let me tell you the game plan for today. We'll first have a presentation by my colleague Sanjeev Gupta. Then we'll have comments by our three panelists, Vitor Gaspar, Laura Wilson, and Seth Terkper. Then we'll have a discussion with a select group of participants. Those of you who are watching on YouTube, we solicit your questions. We'd love to hear from you. You can pose us your questions either at the YouTube chat function or on Twitter at CGDev, hashtag CGD Talks, or by email at events@cgdev.org. So let me now turn to our presenter, my friend and CGD colleague Sanjeev Gupta, who's had a long and storied career at the International Monetary Fund and is recognized as an expert on all things fiscal. As a senior policy fellow at CGD, he's been leading our DRM work for the last 2 years, and he'll present a paper that he prepared with Peter Mullins for this conference. Sanjeev, the floor is yours. Sanjeev, you'll need to unmute. We're not hearing you. You're still muted, it appears. Your mute signal's there.
No.
There
okay,
we go.
no. Okay,
Now
sorry about that.
Start over again, Sanjeev. Great.
Yeah, I'm going to start again. And thank you, Mark, for the introduction, and good day to you all for joining this session. And in this presentation, I'll try to respond to some of the issues that Mark raised a little while ago. My presentation is organized in 3 different ways. One, I will explain why mobilizing more resources is important for low-income countries. And of course, you heard Mark make a reference to it. I will then discuss what the low-income countries have achieved, to present some estimates on where these countries would end up if the past economic growth rates were to prevail. I will then discuss the opportunities for reform in low-income countries and what is needed to achieve their revenue potential. So why focus on DRM? Slide 1, Abdullah. Um, I mean, we've been hearing from Mark and also from the others in the first 2 days of the discussion. We need resources to fund SDGs. And Vitor and his team at the IMF has estimated that the average additional spending needed to achieve the SDGs in 5 key areas, which is education, health, roads, electricity, and water, in low-income countries by 2030 is 15.4% of GDP on average. That's for the low-income countries, and about 4% of GDP for emerging market countries. For the emerging market countries, they can manage. But for the low-income countries, they would need to generate 5 percentage points of GDP on average to meet the resource needs for SDGs. The second reason why we need to focus on DRM is it came out pretty well on the first day of the conference. We need to generate resources to improve debt sustainability, an issue that was labored quite a bit by the first speaker in the conference. How the speaker talked about how high debt service in relation to tax revenues can limit public spending. And finally, the third reason why we need to be focusing on DRM is the advent of COVID, which is likely to have a significant impact on revenue position of LICs for a number of years. And that is for 2 reasons: because of falling tax compliance, and secondly, the changing economic structure. The projections that the fund has done indicate that the average tax to GDP ratio in low-income countries would decline by at least 1 percentage point of GDP in 2020. Slide 2. So what have LICs achieved in the past 20 years? One can argue that by has domestic resources in the past 20 years or so. On average, tax to GDP ratio rose by 4 percentage points of GDP. In fragile states, we have seen similar kind of increase. This compares to a much smaller increase for emerging market countries, where average tax to GDP ratio has remained stable for advanced economies during that time. So resource-rich countries have also had small increase in revenue during the past 20 years, which has leveled over the past few years as commodity prices have fallen. Interestingly, in sub-Saharan Africa, the increase has been about 3 percentage points of GDP during this same period. Slide 3, please. Now, where has this increase come from? VAT revenues as a share of GDP in LICs have increased by about 2 percentage points of GDP. And what is noteworthy is that the VAT rates have not increased in these countries. It's really an improved compliance and widening of the tax base, which has helped raise more revenues. VAT has helped strengthen tax administration as countries have adopted improved technology, such as electronic filing systems. So this is one of the positive developments that one has seen in the low-income countries in the past 20 years. Slide 4, please. So let us look at the performance of other taxes. Revenues from corporate income tax rose from about 1.3% of GDP to 2.5% of GDP during the same period, despite falling statutory rates and concerns with tax planning by multinationals, an issue which has been discussed at length in the international fora. As regarding revenues from personal income tax, they have also increased, modestly from 1.4% to 2% of GDP. However, revenue from this source is substantially lower than in advanced economies. This is because in advanced economies, the tax rates are higher and they are more progressive. And of course, they have better collection and enforcement mechanisms. Now, turning to property taxes, not much is mobilized from this source, roughly 0.25% of GDP on average. This is an area which I will speak to later. There is a lot more potential to work on. So what do we see overall? We see that there is a little change in the ratio of direct to indirect taxes, indicating that the tax system in low-income countries has not become more regressive. On the other hand, this ratio has improved in sub-Saharan Africa, with greater growth in direct taxes during the past 20 years. And finally, some of the work that we have done at the CGD indicates that the personal income tax reforms and strengthened tax administration in these countries has improved income distribution as gauged by disposable Gini coefficient. Slide 5, please. So where would the low-income countries be in 2030 if the current tax system and the past growths prevailed? And I illustrate this with the help of tax buoyancy estimates for sub-Saharan Africa. So this tells us how much tax revenues the tax system can generate going forward. What is buoyancy of the tax system? It essentially captures the response of tax revenues to changes in national income, including the discretionary changes that countries make from time to time. A tax buoyancy of 1 implies that a 1% increase in GDP will increase tax revenues by 1%, thus leaving tax to GDP ratio unchanged. And so the implication is that you would, of course, want to have a buoyancy of more than 1. And what the table here shows is that if you look at the buoyancy numbers, they're slightly above 1 for sub-Saharan Africa, and they are sort of in the same ballpark number when you disaggregate countries in terms of fragile state, foreign aid dependent, natural resource-rich countries, and so on and so forth.
Sanjeev, can I interrupt for a second? We seem to be one slide behind. Could the slide advance, please, to slide 5? There we go. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. Should I, Mark, should I repeat what I said quickly, or?
Maybe just go through the last sentence where you were taking through the chart.
Okay. Yeah. Well, why don't I do that? So essentially, what this figure shows, this table shows, is that the tax buoyancy, both long-term and short-term, is slightly above 1. Short-term is lower, but the long-term buoyancy is slightly more than 1, which means that tax revenues will grow with GDP, and what we would like to see is a very relatively higher long-term buoyancy. And I should also note what we find is that the tax reforms which have been instituted in the recent 10-15 years, they have tended to improve the buoyancy, which has implications of what I'm going to say subsequently. Slide 6, please. So if one takes these numbers of tax buoyancy for sub-Saharan Africa and for 2 countries for which we have numbers, including the estimates which were produced by Vitor's team on the amount of resources needed to fund SDGs in Benin and Rwanda, we find that by 2030, the tax to GDP ratio will increase on average by 0.8% for sub-Saharan Africa, in Benin by 1.4% of GDP, and in Rwanda by 3.2%. That is the last column in this table too. But the bottom line message that comes out from there is that the amount of resources that would be generated, assuming these tax buoyancy numbers, is that the increase would fall short of the amount needed to fund the SDGs. Slide 7, please. So that brings me to the issue of opportunity for reforms. So what can we do on the reform side? And first thing that I would like to emphasize is to focus on curtailing tax expenditures. We see that as a important issue. They are particularly prevalent in corporate income tax and the VAT. And they include things like exemptions, reduced rates, special deductions, tax credits that reduce taxpayers' liability. They are used to pursue different policy goals, but they are ineffective in reaching their objectives. So reforming tax expenditures would improve taxpayer perception of the fairness of the tax system and ensure budget transparency, and of course, generate additional tax revenues. So estimates that exist for tax expenditures show that they are on average about 4% of GDP in Latin America, ranging from 1.3% of GDP in Bolivia to 8% in Colombia. In Africa, they average about 3% of GDP. And I believe that these numbers are highly understated, but they can be as high as 7.8% in Senegal and can constitute 20% of tax revenues. In Ghana, Seth will probably speak to that, the tax expenditures constitute roughly 55% of the tax revenues. There are two dimensions to tax expenditures. One is the exemptions which are given by the countries to, as I said, to corporate income tax and VAT. Other is the exemptions which donors have sought from the countries for their aid-funded projects. And I think action is needed on both sides. The estimates that exist on the aid-funded exemptions amount to roughly about 2 to 3% of GDP for some of the countries that receive a lot of aid from donor countries. And the second point that can help in raising more revenues is improving VAT design and efficiency by curtailing goods eligible for exemptions, lowering rates and reducing rates and zero rates other than for exports, and improving compliance. And as we saw, this is an area which has most potential, and I think we need to clearly focus a lot more, looking at the studies which IMF has done on the potential that exists in raising more value-added tax. Finally, third point is adjusting excise duties. In number of cases, they have not been adjusted. They are specific duties, especially excise duties on goods with externalities, such as alcohol, tobacco, fuel, and motor vehicles. And we can even start thinking about sugar products and imposing excises or special taxes on telecommunication services. And perhaps this is a good time to start correcting fuel pricing, given the current low international prices. And then fourth is strengthening progressive taxation through personal income tax and property taxes. Um, and, you know, as I said earlier, the top personal income tax rates in low-income countries are much lower than in advanced countries. For example, the average top personal income tax rate for OECD countries is 42.8%, while for low-income countries, it is 28%. The top personal income tax also tends to apply at a much higher income level as a multiple of GDP in low-income countries than in advanced economies. And then wider use of um, property taxes will make the tax system more progressive, um, by capturing some of the increases in property prices which are happening all across the world, and also by taxing more educated, productive middle-class workers who capture the benefits of unpriced benefits of urban life, including, as I said, rising value of property. Slide 8, please. Um, Fifth is option that we should focus on is strengthening international taxation, including imposing limit on interest deductions by multinationals, imposing withholding taxes on payments to non-residents, introducing a simple minimum corporate income tax to address potential tax avoidance, and also taxing gains on offshore indirect transfers of interest, an issue which has arisen in some of the countries in Africa. Sixth, this is linked to the point I raised earlier about excise duties. The low-income countries can consider utilizing fiscal measures to assist in mitigation by increasing fuel excises and reforming the taxation of vehicles to encourage the use of fuel-efficient cars, and also correctly pricing electricity. And finally, there is a lot of scope for reviewing non-tax revenues because number of fees and charges have not been adjusted. In some countries, they can be a substantial source of revenue. Final slide, 9. So this is a very heavy agenda, and what Mark said made perfect sense. It's all those things we know what to do, but they are very hard to implement. So any major tax reform will only succeed with strong political will and leadership. Tax reforms tend to be unpopular, and in many countries they face resistance from different sections of society. So clearly, a strong political leadership is required to make progress on such reforms. It is also important to engage with citizens, businesses, and civil society in developing a tax reform agenda. This is especially important at the time with COVID crisis as countries consider fiscal policy reforms options. The next point, I think, which is very important, and it came up on Monday also in some form or the other, one should not just focus on raising revenues without paying attention to improving the quality of spending. There's no point in collecting more revenues if it is wasted. So policymakers must complement tax enhancing reforms with efforts to improve the quality of spending. And it is important that countries periodically review the spending programs to identify and address inefficiencies. I did an exercise and I came to the conclusion that one could potentially save up to 3 percentage points of GDP if one were to focus on improving the quality of spending. And finally, reform packages should not overlook the distributive consequences of the reform measures to ensure that they benefit the less well-off members of society. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sanjeev, for that very interesting presentation. I mean, you make it clear that if the system is left to drift, it drifts positively, but it doesn't nearly do the job that it's going to do. And so you've also put together an interesting proposed set of reforms that we can discuss today. It's now my pleasure to invite Vitor Gaspar to speak. Vitor has been the director of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the International Monetary Fund since 2014. Before that, he served as Minister of State and Finance of Portugal from 2011 to 2013, and that succeeded a long and distinguished career with various European institutions and national institutions. Vitor, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this panel on domestic revenue mobilization for low-income countries with a special reference to the current circumstances having to do with COVID. It's a tremendous pleasure for me to comment on the work of my good friend Sanjeev Gupta. A couple of years ago, we would be doing this together at this point in time. Commenting on your work, Sanjeev, is the best I can do. I will make a number of big picture comments, and unfortunately, I will not be able to stay for the follow-up discussion, but Catherine Bear from the Fiscal Affairs Department, my colleague, will very much contribute to that debate, and she has a very deep knowledge of tax policy, revenue administration, including customs, so she will be ready to engage in whatever way will be useful for the debate. Let me start with a point that Sanjeev emphasized. Tax to GDP is strongly correlated with GDP per capita across countries and over time. And that does suggest that the relation between tax and GDP growth development is a complex relation that one has to think about at a relatively deep level. The way I like to think about it is that tax gives access to the state to a stable source of financing that can be used flexibly to ensure that the state fulfills its functions and in particular allows financial development around a sustainable public debt. So the idea of this block is to think of tax capacity as a fundamental element of state capacity, which underlies public finance, relates to financial development in particular, and development in general. So one should think about tax as an instrument of economic, social, in general, human development. So again, as Sanjeev has already pointed out, we should think about tax in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's exactly how Sanjeev has framed it. Now, COVID-19 makes all choices starker. One fact which I find interesting is that if one looks at countries from sub-Saharan Africa, one notes that not one single country in sub-Saharan Africa has issued in international bond markets since March 2020. So before COVID became truly global. The last country from sub-Saharan Africa to issue was Ghana, and Ghana did a Eurobond operation in February. That was the last one. But low-income countries are much affected by COVID in their revenues, as Sanjeev and Mark point out, but also in terms of general economic developments through commodity prices, international trade, international financing conditions, remittances, and much else. If one looks at the situation, low-income countries have been less affected by cases of COVID than other countries around the world, but if one focuses on social indicators like the incidence of poverty, the risk of malnutrition, general impacts on the health system, the impacts on these countries have been quite stark. So it's very important, despite of COVID-19, that one focuses on the long run, one focuses on sustainable development, one takes the long-term perspective. And in the area of building tax capacity, we need time for institutional building. And that's why the International Monetary Fund, together with the World Bank, the OECD, and the United Nations, promote a instrument which is the medium-term revenue strategy that articulates a strategy to develop tax capacity around 4 pillars. The first one is precisely the link between tax capacity and the spending which is necessary to promote development in a given country. The second has to do with the revenue strategy itself, bringing together tax policy, revenue administration, and the legal system. These various aspects have to work in tandem. The third element is something that we refer to as a whole of government approach. That is, the task of building tax capacity is not a task of the revenue authority alone, the tax authority alone. It's not a task of the Ministry of Finance alone. It should involve all of the government. As a matter of fact, it should involve all of the society in the context of what we could call a political social contract. One needs to have an understanding between the state and civil society, between the state and citizens. And that is something that involves both compliance on the part of the taxpayers, but also accountability and therefore good governance on the part of the state. And several of the elements that Sanjeev was talking about point in that direction. And last but not the least, last and least, the medium-term revenue strategy should include a milestone, should include deliverables, should include measurement tools that allow progress to be monitored, but also international partners that may be helping the country in this important strategic priority to coordinate among themselves to avoid gaps in support or overlaps and wasteful duplications. And that's one of the reasons why the platform for cooperation in tax that puts together the 4 institutions that I have already listed pushes very much for the medium-term revenue strategy. And I would love to continue to discuss this topic, which is a topic which is very close to my heart. I'm absolutely passionate about the medium-term strategy, but Mark, my friend, I have exhausted my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Vitor. I think you very rightly point out that this is an enterprise for the long term that is strategic in nature. It's not a tactical thing. It's a strategic and requires, as you said, the participation of all of government and in fact of all of society. Those are important points. And we're sorry you can't stay around longer to discuss with us, but we're sure Catherine will do well in your stead. So thank you very much for your contribution, Vitor. Let me now turn to Laura Wilson, who's the head of tax strategy and international tax at the United Kingdom's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. In that role, Laura has been instrumental in designing and implementing FCDO's approach on tax and development. Prior to that, she spent several years at the UK Treasury working on EU negotiations and reforms of the banking sector. And before that, she was in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, both under David Cameron and Gordon Brown. Laura, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me here to speak today. As Mark said, I'm here to give a perspective from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So I'll just talk very briefly about our overall approach before attempting to answer the question we've been set. So at a strategic level, when looking across our development work, I'd highlight three common themes that characterize the FCDO approach. Firstly, we aim to establish really deep, strong partnerships with the countries that we support. We support them on the development journey that they want to take, and to this end, we firmly believe in strengthening South-South relationships, ensuring that there's firm country ownership and the political economy in a country is right for the reforms that have been proposed. Secondly, we want to work in partnership to build progressive public finance systems, because our ultimate development goal is about reducing poverty. And thirdly, we aim to be as agile and flexible in meeting this goal as we can, so we can make the most of emerging opportunities and row back in other areas if we aren't making the progress we want to see. So the FCDO niche on this panel, I think, is to bridge that technical expertise on tax systems that the IMF bring with the practical challenges with implementing tax reform that a former African finance minister can bring. So moving on to the question we've been asked to address, how might low-income countries increase their domestic revenues more efficiently and equitably? I'd like to answer this question by talking about three areas: what we need to continue to do, what we need to do more of, and what we should do less of. And I'll do this clearly from the perspective of a post-COVID world and how we can ensure that tax reform and improvements in the expenditure side of public finance systems are firmly established in rebuilding from the unprecedented economic shock we're facing. So the first bit, what can we continue to do? So over the last couple of years, FCDO has been seeking to bring about a number of shifts in the way we do our tax work. I'll talk about three. First of all, we definitely need to keep going with just the relentless pace of tax administration reform to ensure that we're getting revenues in efficiently. The UK has a long history of this. For example, our HMRC, our Revenue and Customs Ministry, has a long and successful partnership with Ghana, which was actually initiated by Mr. Terkper on this panel in his time as Finance Minister in Ghana. So setting aside tax administration, though, we feel we need to be dialing up our efforts on tax policy. And here we would concur with the CGD paper that Sanjeev presented on many of the key reform areas that have been highlighted. We're thinking about tax expenditures, we're thinking about international tax avoidance and evasion, we're thinking about progressive tax measures like poverty tax, like income tax, as well as environmental taxes. And we've been steadily trying to increase our tax policy work over the past few years. For example, we're currently working with the UK's Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Overseas Development Institute to help finance ministries with their specific tax policy decision making. The second shift we're seeking to bring about is to ensure that tax reforms are supporting sustainable and inclusive growth. It's not just about quick wins to boost those tax to GDP levels for a year or two. It's about understanding the nature of different economies, the different stages of development countries are at, the composition of each country's tax base, and working in partnership to optimize the revenues so that economies can grow steadily and generate good quality jobs. So for example, as a result of the African Continental Free Trade Area, it's even more critical that we get domestic tax systems and other elements of the international tax system fully delivering. And the third push is just keep on trying to strengthen the link between revenues raised and the services and infrastructure it financed, as Vitor highlighted just now. We see this as being key to building trust and ultimately, therefore, equity in tax systems. We want to use our relationships in country to promote greater fiscal transparency, creating opportunities for citizens to scrutinise and influence tax and spending decisions. Transparency around issues such as tax expenditures is an element of this approach, but transparency can also help highlight issues of equity across the whole of the tax and expenditure system, not just one or the other. And this is why the FCDO has been pushing for a greater use of fiscal incidence analysis in designing and developing robust reform ideas. So on to my next question, what can we be doing more of? I think we should be looking to build stronger regional partnerships. In the FCDO, we're already working with and supporting the African Tax Administration Forum, and it's our ambition to see regional institutions grow and become leaders in administration and policy support. We see there's a number of advantages that regional players can bring. They are able to showcase successes and illustrate what the realities look like behind those sort of creeping increases in tax to GDP ratios we've seen. For example, what reform journeys have successful revenue authorities and finance ministries been on? What were their successes and failures? It's not donors like the FCDO who can tell these stories best and encourage and inspire other countries to press ahead with these difficult reforms. We need the reformers themselves to do it, and we should be giving them a strong platform to do this. And to this end, organisations like the ADAS Tax Initiative, which again I think Mr. Terkper was an early champion of, and which brings together governments, supporting organisations like the IMF, and development partners could play an important role in doing this if they're given the space to do it. Now, I don't want to downplay the difficulties which lie ahead because of COVID. They are certainly very difficult questions that we need to address. But in those difficulties, there are the nuggets of opportunities which give us the rare opportunities to try and progress. So, for example, now more than ever, we need to be considering the effectiveness of tax expenditures, as Sanjeev mentioned. We need to be looking at options for taxing wealth and income in order to boost the revenues from those who can afford to pay. So before, while preparing for this presentation, I had a look at the latest African Tax Outlook publication. And it included a statistic that the share of the population who pay income tax in that network is 5% compared to 50% in developed countries. And then the percentage of that taxed income was 15% compared to 57% in developed countries. To my mind, these statistics strongly hint that there is more tax that can be paid by the comparatively wealthy without placing additional tax burdens on the poorest. Building on this approach, we need to start considering tax reforms as a key piece in a wider public financing challenge. For example, for different countries, what is the macroeconomic framework that's best suited to their recovery from COVID? What are their plans on debt? What are their plans on spending? How should these four reforms be best sequenced in the medium term? And how can different partners play their part in bringing these reforms about? Thirdly, I think there are policy areas that we need to be learning more about. For example, the gender impacts of tax is a policy area we're thinking about increasingly, and we think it deserves more explicit consideration, particularly given the evidence that COVID has likely affected women, at least economically, more than it has affected men. And just as one small example on the topic of user fees, which was sort of briefly mentioned in the CGD report, I'm sure there's definitely a case for making more use of well-designed fees to mean that public resources are used more efficiently. But the flip side is there's also evidence that these fees can place a disproportionate burden on women. The evidence suggests that where user fees are required to access essential services such as healthcare or education, it tends to be the women and girls who lose access at a higher rate than the men and boys. The final element, what can we do less of? It's always the most challenging part to work out in my experience, but we certainly can't hide from this question at the moment because of the uncertainty around COVID and what the global economic recovery will look like. We have a responsibility to lean in and ensure that the sector is remaining focused on that overall goal of supporting sustainable and inclusive growth. My answer would be that we need to be working less in silos than ever before. For example, we need both civil society and private sector engagement as much on taxation as they're currently engaging on public spending. We need even more coordination in country between multilaterals and bilaterals, especially as our delivery models will remain in flux in the near future. And we need to be looking at both domestic and international and tax improvements rather than a binary one or the other. So to conclude and to wrap up, my message is to just be keeping relentlessly focused on the goal of raising taxes to support inclusive and sustainable growth. Let's work on the policy areas, the revenue authority roles that will build us back stronger from COVID, But let's be really clear-sighted about where those opportunities are actually to be found right now, given the whole tax and spending framework of each country and the political economy opportunities in each country, and build upwards and outwards from there. And as a panelist, I'm very much looking forward to hearing the reflections on this challenge from all the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think you make it clear that taxation, we tend to concentrate on tax to GDP as an objective, but there are multiplicity of objectives in the tax system in terms of equity, in terms of policy, and there are multiplicity of players that have to be kept, if you will, in the loop for them to be effective, making the task all the more complicated for the ministers and others who set tax policy. Before we go on to our next speaker, I'd like to remind the audience on our YouTube channel that we will be collecting questions for our panelists. You can submit your questions by email to events@cgdev.org. You can tweet them to @cgdev or hashtag CGDtalks, or you could submit your comments on the chat function on YouTube as well. With that reminder, I'd like to move to our next panelist, Seth Terkper, who is a chartered accountant, but more importantly was Ghana's Minister for Finance and Economic Planning, and that appointment capped a distinguished career both in Ghana and in many international institutions. Seth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the opportunity to address, the workshop. Could we have the slide, please? So I like to, Sanjeev's presentation actually did much of the work for the initial parts of my slides. So we'll run through those as quickly as possible. So can we move on to the next slide, please? So the point I'd like to take from Sanjeev's presentation is that when we talk about the developing world, and my focus is mainly on Africa, Africa is going through segmentation, and I think it's a topic which should begin to influence tax policy, fiscal management, as well as tax policy. So we do have the advanced, country. We have just one, upper middle income. The categories have been given already, including the fragile states. Next, please. This classification obviously comes from the World Bank, classification of countries, and I would. So it gives the income levels, the per capita income levels. And I'm highlighting this issue because of the growing importance of this topic to both tax administration, tax policy, and fiscal management on the continent, including debt management in particular. Next. Next, please. So here we have the countries. The important thing is to notice here is that about a decade ago, when this was being monitored, or maybe even 5 years ago, you would barely count 12 or so African countries that are middle income, that is lower middle income country. I went to the World Bank website, updated this, a topic I've been following, because I was a minister who got a letter that Ghana had become a middle income country, and the effects are something, sobering. It has increased to 23. Next, please. So we've almost doubled that number of countries. And you can see that it is almost at par now with the low-income countries. The low-income countries in Africa used to dominate. And most of these countries are also resource-rich countries. And so when you talk about their movement to middle-income countries, it's often like Ghana because of resource-rich, being resource-rich, but also growth in various sectors. The yellow highlights, you may wonder, for me, are countries. Sanjeev's work, CDG work, actually focuses on 20 years, but these are countries that have done tax reforms and fiscal reforms, structural adjustment, if you like, for close to 40 years. And so I think it's important that we should go back and see. And I highlight it again, as I would say, because these are also the countries that have some capacities, the middle income countries in particular. But you can see that some of the low income countries on the continent, have been at tax policy administration reforms for quite some time. Some of them have setbacks, like Liberia, because of war, conflict, and the rest, and they slip back, like Sierra Leone. Next, please. We have just a few. upper middle income, 5, if you take out Libya, sorry, 5 or so countries, and then you have Mauritius being the sole, high income country. Next, please. So this is a map. So the question is, which Africa? So I think the tendency, and I like, the paper by Sanjeev because it categorizes, the findings into the various categories, which therefore drives policy. I think it's important to know that it's no longer a monolithic Africa. And I'll give the reasons why it's important for us to focus on it. Next, please. So let me start with the conventional approach, which is where Sanjeev left off. And I wouldn't repeat much of what has been said. Over the period of 20 years, or if you like 40 years for some countries that introduced VAT in the late 1980s to the 1990s, VAT has become, the revenue of choice for revenue, for generating domestic resource mobilization, followed by import duty, which is going to be affected, by protection and by the free trade area conventions and things, which both from Europe and from Africa itself, as has been pointed in the paper. You have income tax, and much has been said about this. There is tax administration, which is very important, and recent reforms, which these countries have also gone through, as has been pointed, are the functionality is very important. Functional administration, segmentation, large, medium, and light tax to give, the focus to particular segments of taxpayers, and integration of domestic taxes, particularly the VAT and income tax. So there's been a shift from tax type. I'm highlighting this to point out that the middle income countries have the capacity also, if you want to look at the countries that have the capacity to improve tax administration and not destabilize the tax structure. Because the problem we are having is that because of weak tax administration, for example, refunds are being blocked, credit is being blocked for VAT, and it's therefore not making it efficient, because you would think that if the VAT cascades, then you will raise more revenue. There's an illusion, because as has been pointed out, in the paper, the buoyancy has not, changed very much over a period of, 20 years or so. Next. So, as I said, the middle income countries are also the resource-rich countries. And this is very important when we come to a conflict, context. But I think these are the countries I mentioned capacity that can implement better processes, because sometimes there are tax institutes, there are tax academies, there are other, and therefore solid tax administration is what is required. And moving to digital, and the fund has done a lot of work in the digital area, electronic platforms and the rest. Now, the key point that is missing, right, is, and I posed this question when I got elected, where is the blueprint for becoming middle income country? Whether on revenue administration or budget expenditure management, or where is the blueprint? There's no blueprint, there's no plan. So if you look at, and I had experience of going into an IMF program, which is ECF, which is meant for developing countries, and yet Ghana was being considered as a middle income country, as I'll point out, losing concessional financing, losing grants, and being driven to the markets, and therefore debt becomes a very big issue. Next, please. So as I said, no mixed strategy. You have an immediate and abrupt loss of, concessional financing. It's gradual, but then it becomes very gradual, including loans. You push to the capital market, and I think it's very important, therefore, to give some attention to debt management in the context. Allocation, and here I link it to revenue. We often spoke, as has been mentioned by Victor, on spending, the quality of spending. But what is the quality of borrowing? What is the quality of debt management? Can we allocate resources, to, not just to interest payments, but more consciously to entire debt service, including amortization. Next, because we have countries that are going to the market and are paying interest only, they are not amortizing. So that's the point, I have here. And this is a very unhelpful habit, because it's a habit that is being taken from rollover risk with treasury bills and bonds, which are never amortized. They are rolled over until there's a crisis, and it is being sent into the capital markets. And this is very important, simply because the revenue that is being generated is not being allocated sufficiently for debt management. Next, please. And I think this should push us also into the finance for development, because finance for development, as I argued in Ethiopia at the time I was a minister, should begin to look at the quality, of financing of projects, but more importantly, the allocation of the resources that are generated towards efficient debt management and borrowing. So this, I am an advocate for resource-rich countries, and that is because these countries, we are going to go for, and when we get out of it, we'll get into the boom era. And these countries, like mine, will generate revenues. They will spend it on consumption. Having borrowed, there wouldn't be insufficient attention paid to debt management. This is the point that I'm making. And therefore, the time, as I said in my conclusion, I will come to that. So I think we should pay attention on revenue management within context of booms and busts. Because once the recovery begins as it's beginning now, the problem with revenue generation in the developing countries is linked to demand in advanced countries. And once the demand increases and commodity prices begin to go up, you see revenue increasing, right? But then it tapers, and then when the crisis, when you have crisis, you no longer have, so coming out of deficits and debt, we must allocate resources for debt management. Otherwise, the tax structure will be tinkered with, and it would not be stable enough, let alone grow, the economy. Next, please. Next, yeah. So let me use quickly Ghana's example. And Nick, when Ghana got additional revenue in 2011 from the oil fields, now 3 oil fields, 200,000 barrels, it allocated some resources for budget stabilization, which is buffers. And during this COVID crisis, Ghana has been able to take 250 million US dollars from that stabilization fund to support the budget. Frankly, if we had been continuing after the increase to 3 oil fields, probably we could have generated about 500 million US dollars. In 2014, 2015, Ghana could master only 250 million Ghana cedis, not dollars, from the same fund. So you can see between 2014, and 2020, the progress that has been made by putting some funds aside, for good times. When the times are good, put it aside and use it to manage. And this is why, as was said yesterday, I am a very big advocate for resource-rich countries like Nigeria and the rest, Angola, which have started this move. We should pay attention to this. Otherwise, the money will go into just, supporting deficits, which is nothing more than consumption. Another element which Ghana used was Ghana put money aside to amortize. Let me give just one example. Ghana used 500 million US dollars from 2014 through 2017 to pay down 500 million out of bond. This is how Ghana did not default on that bond, and then refinance the 250 million. We have since issued 4 additional bonds and refinancing and stretching it out, but the amortization and sinking fund has gone down, and therefore Ghana also has something for emergency. Next, please. Next, please. Of course, it has a amount that goes into the budget, and there's a mandatory 70% that should be allocated for capital projects, because the problem often is lack of sufficient resources after consumption for capital projects, which then goes into budget overruns because you are not in control, of the resources. And then you have the heritage fund and the allocation that goes to the national company. Next, please. The point I wanted to emphasize is more on the sinking fund and on the budget buffers that can be called upon in times of crisis. Now, this is a very interesting chart which we have been analyzing. From the time Ghana started, you can see from 2014, when it started putting money aside for amortizing both the domestic bond, which were interest only, and that is oil revenue. The rate of growth, which you can see in the dark bar, began to decline. And this is the first time Ghana's rate of accumulation of public debt started to decline since HIPIC in 2006. It has always been on the rise. So if It's because of the deep rebasing that we restricted to 2013. Otherwise, if you went back to the earlier graphs, you will see, that the rate at which, was declining. And then when we moved away from amortizing to just refinancing and stretching it out 15 years, 40 years, you see that the rate of growth started to go up again. And when you do this, it means that post-COVID is going to be very difficult for you, to manage, because Ghana is expected to reach about 73% or so of a debt to GDP ratio. And therefore, the allocation of revenue resources during good times is very important. Next, please. So it's about risk management, it's about debt management. As I said, if you roll over, if you refinance and you push it out, you are only entering into rollover risk. You are unlikely going to default risk. And as we speak, it's very important to observe that compensation and interest payments alone are taking such a chunk, of Ghana's budget resources, let alone debt service. And I think the use of revenue resources is very important during good times. Let me emphasize. You don't prepare, for crisis during crisis. You prepare when the times are good. I have said this at the African Development Bank, and I keep repeating it, that the time to prepare for crisis is when you are earning revenue in good times, and then you manage those revenues. And this goes for me more into the non-conventional finance for development. I think this should be a topic that should be considered in the SDGs in terms of, the financing for development, because we need to finance debt. We need to have buybacks, to pay down some of the bonds. In fact, most of the 500 million, that was done through the secondary markets. We appointed agents and they were just buying down the debt. And we began to see the yields, improve. Next, please. I'm almost done. Next, please. And so, in a crisis context, I happen to have come in as deputy minister during the global financial crisis. And let us remember that during this period, the global financial crisis was supposed to be the worst crisis since the Depression. We have moved on, and now it is COVID. And so, as I keep saying, crises are inevitable. You cannot manage an economy without crisis, whether domestic power crisis as we experience, or financial, non-financial. The severity of COVID is because it affected the real sector and it affected, lockdowns and but once the vaccine is discovered, we will be moving out of it. And so, what is the preparation that is required? I think this is a question that needs to be, and I think it's important for the fund, for example, to evolve, criteria for managing mild crisis, medium crisis, if there's a term like that, and severe crisis. Severe crisis, not just in the mode of COVID, but in the mode of the global financial crisis. And the other ones which are often domestic, from conflict and from other, or from crude oil price shocks, which often tend to be, short-lived. And I think this is very important because it will help manage the budget better and help stop the destabilization of the growth of tax reform and the use of tax instruments. Next, please. We're almost done, please. So, as I said, in conclusion, the time to prepare for crisis is not during the crisis. It will happen. We're borrowing because when we take a revenue perspective, as has been pointed out in the paper, countries, even developing countries, are giving tax incentives to the private sector. They are allocating resources. Meanwhile, the taxes are not coming in. So this is not the time to boost revenue. Revenue is going down in conjunction with, expenditure increases. And if you had a buffers, but for the IMF, RCF, 1 billion, and Ghana was supposed to be doing well. And yes, they had to get $1 billion to support the budget, right? Had it continued to put some money aside and all that and not gone into consumption, probably it would have managed the crisis better. And I think Africa should be prepared, for managing crisis through the resources that it earns. There's another, I call it ominous sign for Africa. You would notice that in the early discussions and whatever, this distinction was made between the fragile states, the low-income countries, and the middle-income countries in Africa. And this is where it becomes very important that the middle-income countries in Africa manage their affairs better, because gradually they are being excluded. Not just when you become middle income, but even in the most severest of crises, many of the middle income countries in Africa were regarded as ineligible for much of the debt relief and other, this is which are come. And this means that not just conventional domestic resource mobilization, which I have done almost all my life, but linking it to a better management of the budget. Domestic resource mobilization should be integrated in fiscal management, entire fiscal management, particularly below the line. That is the borrowing. How do you borrow when you're a middle income country? How do you manage your debt? How do you buy back? How do you amortize? And when do you refinance? It may be necessary for you to refinance. And so to quote a book, this time may be seen different, but it's probably not different because for Africa and many countries, it's about commodity, it's about demand falling, and it's about commodity prices going down, and then it's about revenue shortfalls, and then foreign exchange loss. And this is a cycle that repeats itself, whether oil prices are falling, whether it's a global financial crisis, whether it's Ebola. When we talk about COVID, we should remember that for countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia, the Gambia and address where Ebola had an impact, they knew all about lockdown and the rest already. So for them, it is not a new experience, the Congo, right? And so I end here on this note of combining maybe a new approach to utilization of revenues to manage debt better, to have a reverse stabilization of tax reforms and the strengthening of tax administration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Seth, for that fascinating conversation or presentation. I think you illustrate well the complexity of this enterprise. First of all, that countries are not uniform. They are in different situations. But for a country like Ghana, it's changing. Its fiscal and financial situation is changing over time as it grows, as it becomes a middle-income country. It gets more complex. And DRM is one tool in the entire financial management of the country that has to be looked at over time. It's not just for today, but it's for tomorrow and for future years. And your message of preparing for a crisis before the time of crisis, I think, is very well taken. So that ends our formal presentations. I'd like to open it up for discussion with our participants. If you're in the Zoom room, you can feel free to turn your cameras on, and I would ask you to raise your hands if you have a question or have a comment on the interesting presentations we've had so far. So, Catherine, let's start with you. You can use your virtual hands if you want. You find that under the participants list, but Catherine used a physical hand and I saw it. So go ahead, Catherine.
Thank you, Mark. First, very many thanks for inviting me to this event, which has been absolutely fascinating, and for the very interesting and different but complementary presentations. I'd just like to offer a few reflections based on the work that we've been doing in the Fiscal Affairs Department on reforms, especially including in sub-Saharan Africa, but not only. And it's sort of, just as I said, just reflections on some of the comments that participants have made. I think the first overall comment of where is the country in its path on economic development, its economic development path, and what is the actual potential is very important to understand. And I think taking into account a combination of those two considerations, where is the macroeconomy and what is the potential for the macroeconomy, say more concretely from here to 2030, but also looking at the actual design of the tax system and what is being left on the table because of tax policy decisions and revenue administration non-compliance or revenue administration effectiveness. So I think combining those two perspectives is really important. I do think we have to be careful when we say tax to GDP over the last 18 years has risen by 4% of GDP for the low-income countries. I wouldn't perhaps say that is hardly budged, but it's much lower than what we would have liked it to be. So I think we need to be careful how we look at that. And in our experience, what perhaps has been remarkable or notable is that countries have these periods of spurts where they do manage to increase revenues, sometimes quite significantly. But then the question that Laura asked, or Laura's observation then, is how sustainable are these increases over time? And is it clear that the governments are keeping track of where these increases came from? Is that clear, you know, and what investments in either policy changes or administrative improvements those increases reflect? So I think that going to some of the comments that Laura made, I really liked the way that she highlighted the fact that there's so many different aspects to domestic revenue mobilization, that it's such a complex and rich area, but that really there's no one magic formula to improve revenue performance and the health of the tax system, but in fact, very many aspects, and it's a complex process. And I think from that perspective, it is very good to have different types of organizations, excuse me, working together, because we often have slightly different focus of our assistance, and I like to think that that makes it more likely that we will complement each other in the way that we work with the governments. I wanted also to just highlight a comment regarding the blueprint that Seth made. You know, where is the blueprint for becoming a middle income country? And one of the things we have seen in our work is that several countries have been attracted by this idea of a medium-term revenue strategy precisely because it begins to give them a framework, right? How are we going to get from here to there? How are we going to get from 12 to 15 points of GDP, or from 14 to 16? How are we going to actually achieve that? And what is the combination of policy reform, administrative reform, and legal changes that we need to get from here to there, to generate those resources in an explicit and integrated way? I think that I just wanted to call attention to the potential usefulness of a medium-term revenue strategy in helping countries come up with that blueprint. And I guess a final comment also on Seth's, the time to prepare for a crisis is not during the crisis. That made me think about, what about those sectors of the economy that are really benefiting from the crisis, right? That are normally not going to be very compliant, but are reaping huge benefits from the crisis. Is that a time to incorporate those sectors into the tax net? So it's true that the time to prepare for crisis is not during the crisis, but crises also bring opportunities. And so which opportunities is government going to seize on to improve the health of the tax system and its administration during and as a result of the crises? And that we have seen are some positive aspects of the crisis. So those are just some reflections, Mark. I'm sure others will complement what I have had to say.
Some good reflections and good questions for the panel too. Steve Rosner, why don't you introduce yourself, panelists, please? Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to everybody for the excellent presentations and the panel discussion today. This is really a nice bookend to the last 2 days, which I attended on debt and private finance. And I want to echo what Catherine said and what Seth said before, that it's important to think about DRM in the context of an integrated approach to not just fiscal management, but also to policy making and development. So it's great that this is part of the discussion here this week. I wanted to highlight a few things that I didn't hear a lot about in the discussion, but I'm sure that is on everybody's minds, and just time doesn't allow for covering everything in these types of formats. One is I think that we need to be talking more about the stability of tax regimes and of domestic tax systems. And this relates in some respects to what Vitor said earlier about the importance of countries embarking on medium-term revenue strategy processes. One of the challenges that countries face is the ad hoc nature of going year by year, making ad hoc tax changes to address the budgetary needs of the current fiscal year. This is not only bad for planning, but it creates unpredictability for the private sector and for taxpayers, and that's obviously not a good thing for domestic revenue mobilization. So stability of the tax regime is something I think we should be thinking more about, both in the context of the MTRS, but in terms of the way that we talk to our partner countries as donors and technical assistance providers about how we want to work with them to move forward on their DRM agendas. A second thing that we didn't really talk a lot about today, but is sort of the counterpoint to talking about big policy issues like tax expenditures and adjusting excise taxes and things like that, is how we think more critically about tax administration. People often say that we focus too much on administration and not enough on policy. I worry that the pendulum is going to shift too far in the other direction, and we forget that tax administration is still a fundamental piece of the equation, and that the compliance gaps that countries face are as, if not more, severe than the policy gaps that they face in achieving their revenue potential. And in this respect, I think we should take care to spend more sufficient time unpacking what's still not working well about the way countries go about administering their tax systems, including issues like how they deal with compliance risk management, which time and time again, TDOT assessments identify as a sort of a binding weakness of tax administration performance. And by compliance risk management, it's thinking beyond simply doing more audits, but thinking about compliance risk as a whole framework. And since time doesn't allow for much more, I just wanted to sort of put in one final point here is I'd like to hear more about what we've learned over the years in terms of best practices with DRM and tax technical assistance and capacity building. What works? What kinds of approaches are most effective? I obviously echo the comment made by Laura and by Catherine about the importance of coordinating better among bilaterals and multilaterals. But I'd love to really unpack, what it is, what are the best approaches, not just what is the focus of technical assistance, but how does it work best to achieve sustainable results at the country level. So I'll hand the floor over from there, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Hazel from ODI, Hazel Granger, would you like to come in?
Hi, thank you, Mark. Yes, Hazel Granger. I'm a research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute. And I wanted to, well, I agree with everything that the panelists and discussants have said so far. I just wanted to perhaps build on that a bit from the experience of what we're seeing in the countries that we work with in Sub-Saharan Africa under the Tax Dev program. And particularly on this issue, perhaps that picking up on some of the things that Seth said about the timing of DRM in the current COVID crisis. Particularly in terms of understanding how countries can know, when or what measures to use and when. We know that that countries have been affected differently by the crisis, but we're still in the midst of a very deep economic shock. And usually we think about this in terms of 3 phases, where in the first instance you're focusing on support measures to the sectors and the individuals most affected. And then, we normally think about recovery and stimulus measures can support the recovery. And then the DRM would normally come, I suppose, later after the recovery in the consolidation phase, as you're thinking about sort of building resilience and consolidating growth for the future. But at the moment, we're in the we seem to be kind of stuck in between sort of phase 1 and 2, where countries are opening up, but they're still facing difficulties in dealing with the transmission of the virus. So you don't want to open up too quickly. So you're sort of in a balancing act between sort of stimulating demand, but also keeping economic activity under control. And also, trying to maintain that balance is also costly. The DRM situation is urgent, especially in low-income countries, because they're obviously more constrained in terms of costs of borrowing and the ability to spend on stimulus measures to aid recovery. But at the same time, you don't want to do too much DRM efforts that's going to dampen the economy. So I think that suggests that at least for the moment, DRM efforts could focus on very targeted and perhaps temporary measures. We haven't talked much about the issues of solidarity levies, but that could be one option to think about, or at least in terms of targeted temporary measures that can raise revenue among sectors that are managing to sustain profits, or focusing on those able to pay. Targeted measures on the wealthy, for example. And I think that suggests that, there are precedents for that actually for across Europe and elsewhere, like after the global financial crisis, there was the banking levy that was used to sort of pay back the bailouts that were given to banks after the global financial crisis. And there may be other examples, like after World War II reconstruction efforts, and now even the EU has decided to go ahead with a large recovery fund, and there are questions about how that's going to be financed. And in sub-Saharan Africa, in Ghana, for example, Seth will know, they've used targeted levies there for fiscal stabilization. So that's one area that hasn't really come up much. So that was one option, I suppose, that might be worth considering. And then over the longer term, I think, as Laura said, it's important to think about how the tax system aligns with broader policy objectives. And that might be important to sort of think about in the context of how the countries have been most affected. And we know that in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the countries that have had the greatest impacts have been oil-dependent countries or natural resource-dependent countries, those that are dependent on tourism and exports. So anything that countries can do now to aid recovery in those sectors is going to support DRM efforts in future. But it's also important to push ahead with a broader package of reforms that will help with economic diversification and supporting private sector development that's going to boost exports. And that can also then mean, rationalising the incentives, tax incentives, to make sure that they're aligned with those specific policies. Also on the oil issue, this could also fit with potentially supporting the green economic recovery, which hasn't really been talked about much. But countries could take advantage of the current global low oil prices to either increase or introduce fuel duties, or to remove energy subsidies, which could help support the reduction of fossil fuels in future. And then, of course, the sort of broader equity perspective, as people have said, I agree that, could think about ensuring that over the longer term, the personal income tax is more progressive, use of property tax. We could also look wider at the broader taxation of different sources of income and wealth more generally, which hasn't really had much discussion yet. And then, of course, there are benefits of investing in equity for growth as well in the long term, because those funds could be specifically used for funding the infrastructure and human capital development that countries need to grow in future. So that's what I had to say about that on those sort of broader policy objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. I'm sure our panelists will have some comments, but first, before we go back to them, Jude, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to everybody, Sanjeev, Seth, and Laura. Thanks for the presentations. I think they're pertinent at the moment because yesterday the IMF projected that we are going to be facing a very steep ascent. They call it a long ascent that would be characterized by setbacks. So for Africa, it's going to be really important because most of Africa's traditional partners are probably going to be focused more and more internally. So if we can raise domestic resources, that would be very, very useful. I'm very fortunate because I think I served first on the staff and then in the cabinet of a president who was committed to reform, who wanted to govern sustainably, govern responsibly, and President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And so we had a medium-term expenditure framework. We tried to reform the tax system, but even her noble intentions were not immune to the dynamics of politics. I think it's important to be able to understand if we're going to do anything with domestic resource mobilization is to understand that there are interest groups and how those interest groups dynamics work with determine the extent of the reforms. So politics are expensive as everywhere. And if we're going to raise domestic resources, then one of two things are going to happen. People who were not paying taxes before are going to be brought into the tax base, or people who were not paying enough taxes, those taxes are going to increase. More often than not, those people are the same people we turn to if we need to finance our elections. So we need to be reelected. We need to have our colleagues reelected. And those people who are contributing to our elections, for those of us in government, they're not doing it out of pure love for democracy. It is an investment because they believe that the outcome for them under our administration is going to be better. And so the problem of domestic resource mobilization is not simply one of technical economic reforms. It's also about the political economy and mapping the stakeholders and interest groups within there. And so as we think about these things and think about the possibility of being able to do that, it's important that we do not skip over or give short shrift to the political economy and interest groups that are in there, because sometimes it is not the efficacy or the efficiency or the outcomes of an economic reform that drives political actors in that space. It is more mundane things like winning elections. And so I think going forward, as we design these things and have these conversations, it's important for us to also focus on the politics of reform. Thanks.
Thank you, Jude. A real dose of reality there for what has become in many quarters a technical conversation. So we have some questions from the audience, but first I thought we would get a round of comments from the panelists in response to what some of the participants have said. Sanjeev, would you like to start out?
Yes, please. Very good comments, starting with Vitor. And I thought one issue which both Vitor, Catherine, and Steve sort of raised, we need to talk about it a bit more. This is about the medium-term revenue strategies. The concept was introduced in July 2016. And so far, despite the concept being, the way it should be, we have gotten 2 to 3 countries that have formulated this medium-term revenue strategies. So in 4 years, we have gotten, depending on how you define the number of countries, 3 to 4 countries. So one is Papua New Guinea, the other is Uganda, which has a proper concept, and Indonesia, which is supposed to have a medium-term revenue strategy, which is defined in a book chapter. So to me, this suggests something is not working. And should one be placing so much of faith in medium-term revenue strategy? That raises a big question. And we did a paper, which is on our website on this topic. We've also had some interaction with the members of the bank and the fund who are members of this PCT. And so I think this concept needs to be revisited, or at least some aspects of it, to make sure that at this juncture, countries start to make use of it. And then remedy some of the impediments that have prevented countries from adopting these concepts. And of course, I know that there are a whole lot of countries that are in discussion. I also know of countries which are reluctant to discuss for various reasons. So I think we need to move from this stage of the concept to what are the real constraints in implementing the medium-term revenue strategy. Second point, I think I totally agree with Laura that there are a whole lot of aspects to tax policy which or to tax to revenue mobilization, efficiency and equity we need to focus on. And I totally endorse that we should be thinking of looking at the gender aspects of taxation. This is an area which I think a lot of people should be focusing on, but because of lack of data, not much work has been done. And clearly, some of the donors could provide assistance in ensuring that some of the studies are done, at least for countries where household expenditure data by gender are available. And then there is, Seth, I think, raises a whole lot of issues. The formulation of revenue raising strategies is part of the broader macro policy work that countries do, and I totally agree with that. And Seth picked up a number of aspects which are important in that context, including the functioning of sovereign wealth funds, which is important for countries such as Ghana. But I think in the revenue mobilization, and in Ghana's case, one should not ignore the fact that over time, Ghana hasn't made major strides on revenue mobilization, and that raises the issue. Why is that? Why is that we are not able to, despite the fact there was a huge amount of support from the international community to Ghana? I was involved for a number of years in helping the country in raising more revenues, but we didn't really make much headway. And so it will be interesting to see why we didn't really make much success in Ghana, and why the tax expenditures in Ghana tend to be so high as a share of tax revenues, probably one of the highest in the sub-Saharan Africa region. So that's and I think all the points which have been put on the table, they are all very relevant points, and some of the areas we should try to go deeper into in our future work. But I think the point remains that going forward during the COVID era, there are different dimensions which one has to take into account. One is, of course, one can't go and start raising taxes at this point when the economy is tanking. But there are things which we should be thinking of doing because sooner or later, the economy is going to recover. And what do we do at that point? And some of the first steps ought to be to reverse some of the concessions we have given at the time of the COVID. Countries have lowered their VAT rates. Countries have given exemptions to a lot of imports. Those things will have to be set right to be able to restore the tax base if we want to continue the path to raising further revenues. Mark, with this, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Laura, do you have some reactions to the collected comments?
I will try. There are so many and broad points that were raised, and I don't think I've heard a single thing that I disagree with. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not sure. But I'm going to take it as a good thing. I'll just highlight a few things that really sort of struck me and reiterate those points. When Seth talked about linking DRM to the better management of the fiscal system overall, yes, that very, very much struck a chord, and that's something that we should be trying to crowbar into these discussions, and I know that's happening. When Catherine sort of raised the spectre of taxing the digital economy as well, that clearly struck a chord. I think we're all waiting to see what comes out from the OECD's taxing digital economy negotiations, but I would stress that we really want to ensure that that process is a genuinely inclusive process if we're going to have a sustainable, long-term sustainable reforms on international taxation. I think when Steve spoke about the unpredictability for the private sector and the need for that stable tax system, I think this is where I'd really like the private sectors to step up and tell us that they care about stability of the system, and like be bold and say that is more important to them in investing in a country rather than getting exemptions. I've not seen evidence like that is the case, but I would like the private sector to start engaging more in that debate. When Hazel talked about seeing tax policy, seeing tax align with wider policy objectives, I think she was speaking then about using tax as a policy tool. And that again speaks to the issue of tax expenditures. It's not necessarily tax expenditures are all bad. I think we need this nuanced approach to them, looking at the ones which can work well when well designed to stimulate growth, but putting that in that broader package and not being afraid to try and sort of dial those back down again once an economy or a sector of the economy has grown. And finally, of course, Guido kind of just nailed the whole thing really when he mentioned that this is all political. There are a lot of technical, we have learned so much about how the technical side of reforms help, but ultimately you can fly in your best technical experts if there isn't that political will for reasons that maybe an outsider to the country can't necessarily see when the reforms aren't going to take hold. And that's something that's central to what we try and do in the FCDO. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Seth, Sanjeev issued a bit of a challenge in his remarks, but it also coincides well with a question we got from the YouTube audience and what Laura just said. So one person asked, in the case of Ghana, could we hear from the minister, what were the key political constraints and how did reformers work to overcome them? Could you draw any general lessons? And I think, again, this is what we're looking for, is in many ways, this assembled mass knows the technical constraints, but it's the political constraints that are going to be binding. So perhaps you could talk to that and anything else you'd like to address on other people's comments. Thank you. I need you to unmute, please, Seth.
Thank you. Always a reminder.
Yeah.
Ghana has been involved in tax reforms for many, many, many years. But quickly, Ghana delayed in deciding whether it wanted a revenue authority or not. If you recall, it was only in 2009 that Ghana actually enacted a law for a true revenue authority. We had a structure that didn't have that apex body. And this was done in conjunction with other delays between 2013 and 2016, which is the domestic tax division that integrated VAT and and income tax, something which Ghana's peers, Uganda and the rest, had done a long time ago. And then it also did segmentation rather late, again, something which, so these were some, reforms that were done within a very, short period of time, including enhancements of tax laws that were 25 years, 20 years old, 10 years old. And so that was the volume. What was missing was funding, which was to come for revenue modernization phase 2 administration, which was to focus on the tax offices and enhance electronic platform. That never came, to today. So that is a major constraint. The one factor in terms of tax to GDP ratio, Ghana has done 2 rebasing. The first one increased the GDP by 60%. Obviously, the denominator increases, and therefore it affects a static, numerator. And I recall that it brought Ghana's tax to GDP ratio from the peer group of about 17.5% down to about 12%, and we had to plow back. And then Ghana recently did another rebasing, which increased the GDP by about 25 to 30%. And so, in as much as it tells us that yes, there is potential, particularly in the services sector, which is the largest sector of the economy now, and one of the most difficult to tax also, it only came out with the fact that more is needed. And so a very very comprehensive revenue administration reforms that would attend to tax offices in terms of their training, because you integrated VAT and you integrated the income tax officials who were doing just one in parallel, and now needs to be trained along functional lines and others. So those are some of the examples, but I think this is the topic which I'll be willing to engage in, with FED. It's a case study, of tax reform. Tax expenditure, I think it's been explained. I think what we need to do is to move to a credit system. Because if you, particularly for government projects and for major development projects, World Bank and others and all financiers, their loan does not pay taxes. And therefore it's up to the government to either make an allocation out of the budget, for payment of those taxes, which will boost, the taxes, but it will go out also as expenditure. So one of the things about tax expenditure, it tends to also, lower, the potential for tax revenues if they were for a fully integrated system where every ministry, department, and agency budgets for their tax inclusive expenditure, which would have meant that there would be no exemptions. And this is the case not just for Ghana, but for most of, sub-Saharan Africa. So getting that mechanism to shift to a credit mechanism so that, the Controller and Accountant General makes allocation, for tax expenditures in the form of cash, which must be paid to customs and then therefore boost, revenue. It's a wash, but then it gives you the true potential, of your revenue, and probably it may lead to better management of tax expenditures, because now you would have to pay it out of your resources. Just 2 quick points. Yes, to Catherine's point, actually Ghana has, over the years, within context of austerity programs, what they call temporary taxes. And usually these are temporary taxes, income tax and then import duty at low rates that are imposed on sectors that are benefiting during austerity. And these are normally the digital, financial and corporate income taxes go up, but then it's taken off. It's taken off within, say, the duration or even shorter of the austerity program. And so I think that is something which, can be adopted. But the trick there, or the most important thing there, is the discipline to take it off. If it's 2 years, you take it off at the end of 2 years. And if it's 3 years, you take it off at the end of the austerity. And some of that is in place now. So actually the financial sector and others and the digital economy, which are benefiting, and there was an increase in the what we call the communication service tax actually, which has been lowered, with during the crisis. So that is there. But I do agree. But the important thing to note in the case of COVID is that this tax has not been as effective as it used to be in other austerity, and that is because of the lockdown. Overall revenue was going down, so it was only coming in, to fill some of the gap, that was missing, because the COVID effect on revenue was more widespread than previous crises which hit just specific sectors. So I think that is those are. Let me just pause at this stage, and then in terms of political experience, I think Ghana was fortunate between 20 to have had a president who was also commissioner of taxes, and let me say a minister for finance who has been involved in tax reforms for a very long time. And so the agenda, frankly, during that period, was, to catch up with the reforms, as I said. The question of revenue authority. Do you want the revenue authority or you do not want it? You have to settle it. Segmentation, which was delayed. If you take Uganda, Tanzania, and the rest, those were the peers, and they were moving far ahead. So those were the things that were. So there was a political support from the president, who was, a tax, administrator at the highest level, and he was vice president also. Then his vice president, who became president after he was deceased, was chairing the economic management team and gave us significant and tremendous support, to push the reforms. So I think we were only fortunate to have tax and fiscal people at the helm of affairs, which made it possible to implement many of those. I wouldn't say without a cost though, because there are a lot of people who think that the government lost on account of some of these measures that were pushed through. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Catherine, did you want to come in for a couple of minutes before we start the wrap up?
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. Just first of all, thank you for everyone's comments, and Seth, very interesting comments on Ghana. Thank you. Just on going back on Sanjeev's question about medium-term revenue strategies, and I think he's hit on something. I think medium-term revenue strategies are not going to be simple for countries. First, because of the integrated nature of the initiative, but what I've seen is really interesting are two aspects I just wanted to bring out. One is that for the first time in medium-term revenue strategy approach, one has a pillar or an aspect that takes into account these political economy aspects of tax system reform. Engaging different kinds of stakeholders within government and outside. And we know this is a process, that this doesn't happen overnight, and very much tied up with countries' political processes and governance issues. So I don't think that, these are going to be quick processes, but the fact that they're become explicit is very important for increasing the chances that you can reform the tax system. I just wanted to quote one AFR official who said to me last September when we were doing a workshop on MTRS, who said, we really needed this yesterday. The Congress keeps on asking us, to government, you have these very nice national development strategies, you have some kind of expenditure strategy, but you don't have anything on revenue. So can you please get to work and develop your proposals on tax policy reform and how you're going to generate this revenue? So it's something that it encouraged me to think, well, the countries are asking for it. This is very important. And a final comment I wanted to make is on the role of customs. Seth said something about customs, but we really haven't talked about that much about customs administration and the potential for revenue generation. We've recently started to do this mirror analysis with customs administrations, looking at, this is the base of revenue from customs, which is the value of imports. And the mirror analysis indicated that undervaluation is on the order of 30% for one large African country. sub-Saharan African country. So I think that there's a huge potential there. Just wanted to remind that we should not underestimate or forget about customs. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Mark, may I break protocol a bit and just on
Sure,
a medium term, medium term revenue strategy? I think at the operational level, it should be linked in a PFM framework with a medium-term expenditure framework. When we did the GIFMIS, the Integrated Financial Management Information System, under the coding and classification, we actually coded all our revenues and integrated it as such. And so within that context, you have the medium-term revenue framework linked to the medium-term expenditure framework. And therefore, when you begin to do your budget, analysis, you are going to, revenue is often seen as sitting, outside, expenditures, to the extent that when you talk about PFM, people even equate it to just expenditure. We were in the process of working with FED, before we left office. I didn't know that Ghana had not continued, but that would be my integration to work. My recommendation is to work with the World Bank to place it within context of the IFMIS, so that the tax electronic platform systems and whatever becomes part of the overall, IFMIS, framework, both in terms of the structure, in terms of the electronic platform, and so that's what I want to.
Thanks, Seth. Okay, we just have a few minutes left, and I think today's discussion has underlined the complexity of the challenge of raising revenues, of putting it in a longer term framework, of understanding the financing of a country. And this is a complex time. It's a tough time for politicians. It's a tough time for technicians to maneuver their way through. So here's my challenge to you. If you have 1 minute to give advice to, say, the president of a country as to what he should ask of his minister of finance or his head of his tax authority, what would you urge him to push on? What's the 1 or 2 actions that you think he should take now that's going to sustain him in the long run, that's going to set him on the right course to a higher level of domestic resource mobilization, given the complexity of COVID? It's a horrible challenge to present to you, and I did it without giving you any time to prepare, but I will see if you can rise to the occasion. I'm looking at faces. Laura, do you want to start?
I'll give it a go. I mean, again, I think it comes back to something that Catherine said and that I tried to highlight in my presentation. He's got to understand that where he is on, or she, on the tax potential curve and the economy. But I think he or she has to start from that basis. Where am I looking at economically? Where am I doing developmentally? What is my tax base looking like? And where do I look outlying compared to some of my peers? I would start my analysis from there.
Great, thank you. Seth, what you're going to tell the president? I need you to unmute, Seth.
I'll tell my president and other African leaders and developing countries for that matter, pay attention to revenue administration. Because in as much as it's thought that a lot has gone into revenue administration, without getting the revenue administration working and agree on the enforcement end, you would always think that there's a problem with your tax structure. There's nothing wrong with VAT. Refund is a part of it. Credit is a part of it. Then when not getting the administration to generate revenue, there's a tendency to think that we can block refunds, we can use it and whatever. So my advice would be pay particular attention to revenue administration and sustain it, over a period of time.
Great, thank you. Catherine, you're going to speak for the entirety of the IMF. What would you tell the president?
Oh, I wasn't aware you're going to put me on the spot, but since you are, very much agree with Laura. Understand where you are on the development curve and look at where your potential is, both on the policy side and on the administration side. And get yourself a good team of people to advise you on how to get from here to there. Based on a lot of work that's been done on your country, and bring in the donors in a coordinated way once you've decided your course of action. There are a lot of people waiting in the wings, but we need to give them clarity regarding how they can best help us.
Thank you. Sanjeev, I'll give you the last word.
I think when Laura and Catherine talked about the potential, if one looks at the numbers for most of the countries, it ranges from 3 to 4 percentage points of GDP. So the ministers would have to pick up what is feasible and what they can really fight in the system to be able to push through, whether it be some expansion of VAT, would it be some trimming of tax expenditures? It would have to be based on the political system, based on what kind of resistance the minister is likely to face. And I think one would have to start small, target 1 percentage point of GDP to start with, and then go on over a period of time to make major reforms. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Sanjeev. All good suggestions at the very end. So let me thank the panelists for their contributions today. Sanjeev, of course, for your presentation, which was excellent, and the participants who were up to the challenge of being panelists as well. I appreciate all your comments, and I very much appreciate the audience who was faithful in listening to us. There were a few more questions from the audience that we weren't able to take. I apologize for that, but time is limited. On behalf of CGD, again, thank you for coming to this conference. I would remind you that we have one more session tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Washington time. And this is a panel of development leaders from the private and public and philanthropic sector to try to bring together the various themes that have been raised over the last 3 days and to try to make sense of them for a strategy going forward to increase the amount of financing available, particularly to low-income countries, in their quest to get through this COVID crisis and to set themselves back on the road to the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030. So again, thank you very much for your participation and attendance, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thank you.